The walls of the Musk home, once warm with the sound of laughter, now echoed with an unbearable silence. It was a silence that didn't simply linger. It settled, like dust in untouched corners, like fog clinging to window panes on cold mornings. Emma Musk moved through her days as if submerged in water, each step dragging as though tethered to something impossibly heavy. The death of her daughter, Katie, had torn a quiet, gaping hole in the center of her life, and no amount of sweeping or folding or tidying could reach it. The house was neat. The house was clean. But everything felt hollow. Emma's hands still performed the motions, washing dishes, folding blankets, pressing buttons on the laundry machine, but her spirit seemed elsewhere, floating in some unreachable place where time and meaning had unraveled. Elon, on the other hand, clung fiercely to the past. It became his refuge. Often, Emma would find him sitting alone in the living room, the soft blue glow of the television flickering across his face as home videos of Katie played on a loop. Her voice, so bright and musical, filled the room, but only the room. It could not reach Emma's heart. She would stand in the doorway, frozen, unable to cross the threshold, as if the footage itself might shatter her. They tried, both of them, to find their way back to life. They went to a grief support group, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with people whose pain was written in the slump of their shoulders and the cracks in their voices. Elon listened, sometimes spoke. But Emma drifted. She found herself resenting the quiet insistence that Katie is in a better place. The words landed like stones in her chest. Better place. Emma didn't want a better place. She wanted this place, this life, this daughter. At home, friends and neighbors appeared in careful bursts. They brought casseroles, soft embraces, and words carefully chosen to avoid the jagged edge of loss. Their kindness was sincere, but their visits were cautious. They sidestepped Katie's name like it was a fragile vase they dared not touch. Emma noticed. She noticed everything. When Emma's brother, Isaac, came to visit one afternoon, his face bright with the nervous joy of unexpected news, Emma felt a strange tightening in her chest. His girlfriend was pregnant. A new life was coming. Isaac's happiness was palpable, but Emma's response was measured, a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was glad for him, of course she was, but his news stirred something sharp and bitter inside her. The timing was unbearable. Her relationship with her father, Nathan, had frayed under the weight of years, but unraveled completely in the months after Katie's death. Nathan had once lost his own son, a brother Emma barely remembered, and he tried in his way to reach her through that shared fracture. "I know this pain," he told her. "I've walked through this fire." But Emma rejected the comparison, her grief so unique, so vast, that it felt impossible to be paralleled or understood. One evening, Elon dared to voice a thought that had been pressing at the corners of his mind. "Maybe we could have another child," he suggested softly, almost apologetically. But Emma recoiled, her answer swift and sharp, as if the very idea dishonored Katie's memory. There was no replacement, no healing through new beginnings. To Emma, the door to motherhood had closed forever, its hinges rusted shut. In the quiet days that followed, Emma began to give away Katie's things. First the clothes, carefully folded and packed into boxes. Then the toys, the books, the colorful drawings, still taped to the walls. Each item removed felt like a tiny release, a loosening of the knot in her chest. But when Elon came home one evening to find Katie's cat gone, a small, soft creature who had curled at the foot of Katie's bed every night, his voice cracked. "You gave her away, without telling me?" Emma's silence in response was louder than any argument. She didn't trust herself to explain. She couldn't bear the weight of the memories, not even in the fur of a sleeping cat. With each unspoken word, each small decision, the distance between Emma and Elon grew. They orbited around each other in the same house, bound by the same loss, yet pulled in opposite directions. His grief anchored him to the past. Hers propelled her away from it, desperate to lighten the unbearable load. And perhaps that is where the deepest ache lies, not only in what is lost, but in what is left behind. in the quiet spaces between two people who no longer know how to reach each other. But maybe, just maybe, those quiet spaces still hold something waiting to be found. Dear viewer, if this story has stirred something in you, I would love to hear about it. Perhaps you, too, have known a silence that lingers or a memory you can't quite let go. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I do read them, every single one, with the tenderness they deserve. And if you'd like to continue walking alongside Emma and Elon in this story, I would be honored if you'd stay with us. A simple like or subscribing helps me know you're here, quietly listening, and that means more than you might think. This is only the beginning. The house had once been filled with Katie's presence, her drawings taped to the refrigerator, her dolls propped carefully on shelves, her tiny shoes lined up near the door. But now Emma could scarcely bear the weight of them. One morning, without warning, she began peeling the drawings from walls, the tape snapping sharply in the quiet house. Each tug of her hand seemed to echo louder than the last. "Elon, I need them gone," she said flatly, cradling a pile of crumpled papers against her chest. He turned from the kitchen sink, his brow furrowed, the protest already rising in his throat. "Emma, wait. Can we just leave them a little longer? Please. It feels like she's still here when I see them." Emma didn't look at him. That's the problem. The pile trembled in her arms as she moved toward the trash bin. Elon crossed the room quickly, his voice catching. "Don't throw them out. We can put them away, just not like this." But Emma's hands were firm. The more he pleaded to preserve Katie's things, the bedtime stories, the Sunday pancakes, the softness of her small routines, the more Emma resisted. To Elon, these familiar habits were sacred, a way to keep Katie near. To Emma, they were anchors pulling her under. Their communication began to wear thin, as if words themselves had turned brittle. Conversations grew careful, sentences clipped, each afraid to set the other alight. Elon would reach for her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder or brushing against her back in the kitchen, but Emma would stiffen, her body folding inward, her eyes downcast. When he leaned in to kiss her temple, her skin flinched almost imperceptibly, yet enough for him to feel it. At the grief support group, Elon found a fragile sense of belonging. He sat beside men and women who spoke openly, sharing the shape of their loss in words he clung to like driftwood. Emma, however, sat taut in her chair, the room's sympathy pressing against her like a wall. Their sorrow felt too polished, too contained. She could not find herself in their stories. Her grief was not a quiet ache. It was jagged and untamed, and she could not bring herself to soften its edges for the sake of comfort. Back home, the sympathy of others became its own kind of prison. Friends still left voicemails with hesitant kindness. Neighbors offered casseroles wrapped in foil, careful to avoid mentioning Katie's name. The house itself felt embalmed in stillness, the grief suspended in the air like dust that refused to settle. Emma moved through the rooms as though tiptoeing through a museum of a life they'd lost. When Isaac's girlfriend Abigail entered the picture with her unexpected pregnancy, Emma's discomfort sharpened. Abigail was scattered, often late, her stories shifting like sand, her laugh too quick, too loud. Emma's protectiveness over Isaac tangled with a quiet irritation. She feared Abigail's unreliability, feared that her brother, still so trusting, would be the one left to gather the pieces when things inevitably fell apart. Isaac, of course, defended Abigail with a tenderness that only deepened Emma's worry. Their conversations slipped between gentle teasing and sharp-edged warnings, the tension always simmering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Elon's patience thinned like worn fabric. The more Emma pushed him away, the more helpless he became. He begged for closeness, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet rituals, reaching for her hand during walks, inviting her to sit beside him when watching old videos of Katie. But Emma would always retreat, always decline, her voice steady but distant. Her father, Nathan, visited on Sundays, his presence a careful blend of warmth and restraint. Over cups of lukewarm tea, he gently urged Emma to consider returning to work, or perhaps finding a new project to occupy her mind. He never pressed, never scolded, only planted the suggestion like a seed he hoped would take root. Instead of work, Emma found herself drawn to the past. One afternoon, she returned to Katie's schoolyard. She stood behind the low fence, watching as children tumbled across the playground, their voices rising like birds. She could almost see Katie there, her little legs scrambling up the slide, her sun hat slipping sideways, her laughter sharp and bright in the breeze. Emma stayed until the school bell rang and the playground emptied, her hands tightening around the straps of her bag as if to hold herself together. That was when she first saw Julia. The teenage girl, thin and pale, lingered near the bike racks, her movements hesitant, her gaze lowered as though weighed down by a burden no one else could see. Emma's breath caught. She knew Julia. She had seen her face on the police reports, on the edge of whispered conversations. Julia was the girl who had accidentally caused Katie's death. Emma began following her, at first by chance, then by quiet design. She would find herself walking the same streets, watching from across the park as Julia fed the ducks, observing her from a distance as she boarded the bus to school. It wasn't hatred that tethered Emma to her. It was something harder to name. A sharp, restless curiosity. A need to understand the girl who now carried a thread of Katie's story. At home, Elon tried again to bridge the distance. He asked to talk, but their conversations circled the same weary patterns, pleading, withdrawal, frustration, silence. Each word seemed to ricochet off invisible walls. Each attempt to reach one another slipped further out of grasp. In time, they began to occupy the same space with the quiet precision of strangers. Breakfasts eaten in silence. Doors closed softly, deliberately. Grief had carved out two separate worlds within the same house, and neither of them knew how to cross the widening distance. The fractures beneath the surface were deepening, and somewhere in the quiet ache of those days, Emma continued to follow Julia, her steps light, her purpose uncertain, as if chasing something she could not yet name. It took Emma 3 weeks to cross the invisible boundary from distant observation to reluctant approach. She had watched Julia from across sidewalks, schoolyards, and coffee shops, unsure of what she was chasing. But on a gray afternoon, her feet simply carried her forward, as though the weight of silence had become too heavy to bear. She found Julia sitting alone on a worn bench in a quiet park, her thin frame curled into herself, sketching absent-mindedly into a small notebook. Emma's breath trembled as she stopped in front of her. "Julia." The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes, a soft green-gray, were rimmed with fatigue and shadowed by something Emma recognized instantly, guilt so heavy it shaped the way she sat, the way she breathed. "I'm Emma Musk." Her voice caught. I wanted to talk." Julia blinked, unsure whether to run or to stay. "Okay," she whispered, barely audible. Their first conversation stumbled along awkward paths, pauses longer than sentences. Emma had expected to find anger, defensiveness, perhaps even denial. But Julia's voice was soft, her answers careful, her remorse palpable. She didn't shrink from responsibility. She didn't offer excuses. "I think about her all the time," Julia said quietly, her fingers nervously folding the edges of her notebook. I still see her sometimes in dreams. I still hear the sound." Emma's throat burned. Part of her wanted to scream, to blame, to force Julia to carry more of the burden. But instead, she found herself sitting down beside the girl, their shared silence stretching gently between them. The meetings began to repeat, accidentally at first, then by quiet design. They became two people walking parallel roads, tethered by an unspeakable history. Emma did not tell Elon. She could not find words to explain why she sought out the very person connected to the accident that had shattered their lives. At home, Elon noticed the distance widening. Emma left for long walks without explanation. She returned later each day, her gaze thoughtful, her voice distant. He asked where she'd been, but she offered only vague answers. A sharp, familiar ache settled in his chest, but suspicion had no clear target. He only knew that something was slipping further out of reach. One afternoon, As they sat on their usual bench, Emma noticed the pages in Julia's notebook filled with colorful sketches and speech bubbles. "What's that?" she asked, leaning closer. Julia hesitated, then slowly handed the notebook to her. "It's a story I've been working on. A comic, actually. Science fiction. It's silly." Emma turned the pages carefully, her thumb brushing over the hand-drawn panels. Aliens, portals, shimmering universes layered over each other like thin sheets of glass. Julia pointed to a frame where a character gazed at an alternate version of their life through a rip in space. "I was thinking maybe there are other worlds, you know? Places where different choices were made, where things didn't go wrong." The idea clung to Emma long after they parted that day. She found herself wondering, could there be a universe where Katie still chased butterflies in the garden, where the last goodbye had been delayed by mere seconds, where her daughter's laugh still echoed through the house? Julia later presented her with a small, homemade comic book, a neatly stapled collection of the story, now complete. Emma accepted it with an unexpected tenderness, the handmade pages offering her a strange, quiet solace. Elon, meanwhile, found his own, more desperate refuge. A man from his grief support group had once mentioned that marijuana helped him soften the edges. One evening, Elon accepted the offer, sinking into the haze of it with a mixture of guilt and relief. The numbness didn't heal, but gave him brief shelter from the relentless tide of memories. When Emma and Julia spoke again, their conversations drifted toward the question that neither could answer: the role of fate in what had happened. "Do you think everything's written already?" Emma asked, her voice soft, her gaze distant. Julia shook her head, but her words were unsure. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels like accidents just happen. Like life is chaos, and we're all pretending there's meaning." "But if it's chaos," Emma whispered, "then why does it feel like I'm being punished?" Julia didn't answer. At home, Elon's grip on the past tightened. He began watching the same video of Katie over and over, a 10-second clip of her twirling in the yard, her voice calling, "Daddy, look at me." The more he played it, the less real it seemed, as though the memory itself was fading under the weight of repetition. The distance between Emma and Elon thickened, like fog in the corridors of their house. Words, when they came, looped into familiar frustrations. One night, the tension finally splintered. "Why are you so desperate to erase her?" Elon demanded, his voice raw. Emma's response was immediate, fierce. "Because she's already gone. Clinging to all this, it's like dragging her ghost through every room. It's not a ghost, it's our daughter. I can't let her disappear. And I can't breathe in this museum of grief." Their argument crashed into silence, both exhausted by the weight of it. There were no victors, only the widening space between them. Meanwhile, Isaac's world moved forward. Abigail's belly rounded with new life, each passing month forcing Emma to confront emotions she scarcely knew how to name. Envy, sorrow, guilt, all tangled into something sharp. She struggled to imagine a future where joy could safely exist again. Nathan tried to reach her through the familiar roads of memory. He told her about the son he had lost, Emma's brother, a baby she never knew. He spoke of the decades spent carrying that ache quietly in his chest. But Emma brushed him aside, her voice cold, distant. "It's not the same. It's never the same." Nathan's sigh was heavy, but he did not press her further. In the spaces between these moments, Emma continued walking unspoken roads. Roads that curved toward Julia, toward parallel universes she longed to believe in, toward questions she was not yet ready to answer. Emma sat rigid in the circle of folding chairs, her hands clenched in her lap as the grief support group meandered through soft-voiced confessions and nods of quiet understanding. She had agreed to attend only because Nathan had gently insisted, his steady persistence slowly wearing down her walls. Yet even here, surrounded by those who also carried unspeakable losses, Emma felt as though she were on the outside, her grief jagged and unruly while theirs seemed tamed, manageable, spoken into neat sentences. Elon sat beside her, his posture tense, his gaze flickering toward another woman across the room. Her name was Claire, a widow who spoke with a calm that Elon found disarming. He had spoken to her briefly after the last meeting, drawn to the steadiness in her voice. Tonight, as the group dispersed, he lingered again, seeking in Claire a kind of understanding Emma no longer seemed willing to offer. Claire did not press him, did not offer shallow comforts. She simply listened, her eyes meeting his with quiet patience as Elon admitted that he felt invisible in his own home. It was not attraction that pulled him toward her, it was the fragile relief of being seen. Emma's world, meanwhile, continued to tilt toward Julia. Their conversations had begun to take on a rhythm, the hesitations softening, the silences growing less uncomfortable. Julia often spoke of her science fiction story, the homemade comic that Emma now kept tucked in her bag. The multiverse theory, the idea that countless parallel worlds spun endlessly alongside their own, offered Emma a strange, aching comfort. "Maybe there's a version of me," Julia said one afternoon, her voice thoughtful, "who looked both ways, who stopped in time, who never crossed that intersection." "Maybe there's a version of me," Emma replied quietly, "who isn't broken." Julia's gaze flickered toward her, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her until now. The idea began to live inside Emma, following her through her days like a quiet shadow. Perhaps in another universe, Katie still splashed in puddles after rainstorms, still pressed stickers on Emma's cheeks, still begged for one more bedtime story. Perhaps there was a version of life untouched by this sharp, relentless absence. Elon, unaware of Emma's growing connection to Julia, drifted deeper into a cycle of loneliness. His longing for closeness with Emma became almost desperate, reaching for her hand, lingering in doorways, offering half-hearted suggestions to revisit old vacation spots. But each attempt was met with Emma's silent retreat, her body stiffening, her attention sliding away. Emma spent long afternoons watching Isaac prepare for fatherhood. He painted the nursery walls in soft colors, assembled the crib with clumsy determination, his excitement palpable. Emma's emotions tangled inside her, love for her brother, yes, but also a quiet, stinging sorrow that the rhythms of life continued without Katie. Nathan remained a steady, quiet presence. He visited weekly, sometimes bringing Emma's favorite tea, sometimes saying nothing at all. His gentle persistence, his soft questions, were like water slowly wearing down stone. "Emma," he said one evening, as they sat together in silence, "the weight won't leave you, but you can learn how to carry it." "I don't want to carry it," she whispered. "I want it gone." One night, as Elon sat watching Katie's videos, he snapped. "You're erasing her," he said, his voice rising raw and cracked. "You're throwing her away like she never mattered." Emma turned on him, her eyes sharp. "You think staring at those videos brings her back? You're stuck, Elon. I'm trying to survive. By pretending she didn't exist. By letting go of the pieces that are killing me." Their words collided, bitter and unfinished. Neither could cross the canyon growing between them. Later that week, Julia handed Emma a carefully bound copy of her completed comic book. "I wanted you to have this. The whole story." The simple gesture felt like a thread binding them together, something real and fragile. Emma found herself no longer seeing Julia as the driver, the girl who had caused the accident. Julia was just a teenager, trembling under the weight of her own guilt, trying to find her way back to solid ground. Elon's attempts to reach Emma became more pointed, more desperate. He bought her favorite pastries from the little bakery on Elm Street. He suggested taking a trip a weekend away. He asked if they could simply sit together and talk. But each time, Emma pulled away, her distance as deliberate as a locked door. "You're clinging to ghosts," she finally told him, her voice shaking but firm. "I can't live there with you. I have to find a way forward." "And what does that look like without her?" Elon asked, his throat tight. Emma had no answer. Isaac, ever hopeful, invited them to dinner with Abigail, trying to pull them back toward some semblance of normal life. The evening was carefully arranged, the food thoughtfully prepared. They sat around the table, trading stories, trying to step lightly over the cracks beneath them. Emma watched Abigail with cautious curiosity, noticing the way she rested her hand protectively over her growing belly. Elon smiled politely but remained distant, chewing his food with mechanical precision. The undercurrent of tension hummed softly, invisible but deeply felt. After dinner, Elon lingered in the quiet of the living room, the weight of the evening pressing against his chest. The walls of their home felt smaller now, heavy with memories that Emma seemed determined to shed. He began to wonder if perhaps the only way to breathe again was to start somewhere new, to move away, to leave the house, the city, the routines that had hardened around their grief. Maybe in another place they could begin again. Maybe. Elon lingered by the kitchen window one morning, his coffee cooling in his hand, his gaze distant as though he were watching a life no longer his. The silence between him and Emma had settled into something dense and constant, like the air before a thunderstorm. Without turning, he spoke. "Maybe we should sell the house." Emma, seated at the table sorting through unopened mail, didn't look up. "Sell the house?" "Yeah." He drew in a slow breath. Maybe it would help. A new place. A fresh start. His voice was careful, as if trying to avoid stepping on the sharp edges that now defined their conversations. But Emma's reply was immediate, her hands tightening on the stack of papers. "This is Katie's house. I'm not leaving her behind." "You're the one who wants to erase her." The words slipped out before he could catch them. Emma's eyes snapped to him, her face a mask of quiet fury. "That's not what I'm doing. You got rid of her things. You gave her cat away. And you've built a shrine out of this place." Her voice cracked, raw and tired. "Do you think she's still here, Elon? In the walls? In the carpet?" "Maybe I do," he said softly. The house, once a refuge, had become something else entirely. For Emma, it was a suffocating vessel of memories, every doorframe marked with Katie's tiny pencil measure heights, every corner thick with echoes. But even as she felt trapped within it, the thought of leaving pressed a hand to her throat. How could she walk away from a place where Katie had laughed, where she had lived? Elon, sensing Emma's refusal, began to retreat even further, his silences growing longer, his eyes clouded with frustration. He withdrew into the small pockets of the house, his workshop, the garage, the quiet corners where he could sit and disappear into old videos without Emma's disapproving gaze. Meanwhile, Emma's world continued to pull her toward Julia. Their meetings in the park remained quiet and careful, a kind of ritual neither of them dared to question. Julia had begun to speak more freely, her words less guarded, though they always circled the same unspoken ache. "I can't go anywhere without people knowing," Julia said one afternoon, her voice low as she traced her sneaker along the gravel path. "Even when no one says it, I can feel it. I'm that girl, the one who killed Katie." Emma's breath caught, a familiar burn rising in her throat. For so long, she had thought of Julia as a shadow, a name whispered at the edges of her grief. But sitting beside her now, Emma saw not a villain, but a trembling teenager, trapped beneath the unbearable weight of an accident neither of them could undo. "It was an accident," Emma said softly, the words brittle on her tongue. "You didn't mean to. You didn't wake up that day intending to hurt anyone." Julia's hands shook slightly as she pulled the sleeves of her jacket over her palms. "I still did." Emma's gaze drifted toward the sky, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." That evening, Elon finally confronted her. He'd been watching the distance grow, the quiet hours she spent away, the half answers she gave when he asked where she'd been. "You're seeing her, aren't you?" His voice was tight, clipped, standing in the kitchen doorway like a man preparing for a fight he didn't want. Emma didn't deny it. She simply nodded. "Why, Emma? How can you sit with her? Talk to her? After what happened?" "Because..." Emma struggled for the words, her chest tightening. "Because when I'm with her, I don't feel as angry. I don't feel as hollow. I don't know why, but it's easier when I'm with her." Elon's face twisted, hurt and bewildered. "It's easier to forgive her than to talk to me?" Emma's voice faltered. "It's not about forgiveness. It's about breathing. I can't breathe in this house, with you clinging to Katie's ghost like she's going to walk through the door any second." Elon's silence landed heavily between them, his jaw clenched as he turned and walked away. A week later, Isaac and Abigail invited them to a baby shower. It was meant to offer a moment of lightness, a step toward normalcy. Emma agreed to go, but as the day approached, dread curled in her stomach. The gathering was small, filled with gentle laughter, pastel decorations, and the quiet excitement of impending new life. Emma sat stiffly among the guests, her smile forced, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as Abigail unwrapped tiny clothes and colorful blankets. Elon made polite conversation, but his eyes were distant, his body half turned toward the door as if already preparing his escape. Emma's emotions roiled beneath the surface. The joy in the room felt foreign, almost offensive, as though life had rudely continued without asking her permission. She found herself gazing at Abigail's rounded belly, the softness of it, the promise of new beginnings, and in that moment, a strange pang of jealousy struck her. Life was being added to Isaac's world while hers had been mercilessly stripped away. On the drive home, the silence between them stretched taut. "You can't keep doing this," Elon said suddenly, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "You can't just keep shutting me out. We're supposed to carry this together." "I'm carrying it the only way I know how." "You're carrying it with her," he snapped. "With Julia. And you're carrying it with ghosts. With videos. With a life we can't go back to." They fell into another argument, their words sharp, their pain laid bare but never resolved. Later, Emma sat with Nathan in the quiet of his living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. "There's no right way through this," Nathan said gently. "Grief, it moves at its own pace. There's no finish line, Emma." "But it's been so long," she whispered. "For some things, it will always be too soon." Elon, alone in the bedroom, scrolled through old photos on his phone, his thumb pausing over Katie's smiling face. His longing crystallized into something desperate, a wish not just to remember, but to relive. He wanted to return to the mornings of pancake batter and giggles, to the way Katie's feet thudded down the hallway. Emma stood in the doorway, watching him for a long moment. "We can't go back," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "We can't be those people again." Elon didn't look at her. "I wish we could." "So do I." Her voice trembled. "But we can't." As summer softened into early fall, Emma's meetings with Julia took on a new rhythm. Their conversations, once carefully tethered to guilt, slowly drifted into something deeper, more uncertain. They began to ask the questions that had no answers, the kinds that hovered in the air like mist, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. "Do you ever think there are other versions of us?" Julia asked one afternoon as they sat on their usual park bench, their feet idly tracing patterns in the fallen leaves. "Like, somewhere out there, we made different choices, and things didn't go wrong." Emma stared at the ground, her fingers absently folding the corner of the comic book Julia had given her. "I think about that a lot lately. I think about the versions of me that still have Katie. The versions of you that don't carry this weight." Julia's gray-green eyes softened. "It's strange, but sometimes that's what keeps me going. The idea that maybe we got it right somewhere else." For Emma, the thought wrapped around her like a fragile comfort. The idea of infinite threads, countless outcomes unfurling in quiet, invisible corners of the universe, offered a way to loosen the grip of the life she'd been left with. Maybe Katie still laughed in some distant world. Maybe she never crossed the street that day. Maybe Julia paused just a second longer. Meanwhile, Elon wandered through his own fragile attempts at connection. Claire, the woman from a support group, had become a quiet presence in his life. Their exchanges had been cautious at first, stitched together in the sterile safety of group meetings. But one evening, after everyone else had gone home, they sat alone in the parking lot, the air thick with the hum of streetlights and the weight of things unsaid. He told her what he couldn't tell Emma, that he felt like a ghost in his own home, clinging to memories that no longer fit. Claire listened, her voice steady, her presence warm but undemanding. There was a moment, a brief flicker, when Elon considered stepping into something more with her, something that might offer him a way to feel again. But when her hand brushed his chest tightened, not with longing, but with guilt. His heart recoiled. He pulled back gently, shaking his head, the words catching in his throat. Claire understood. They parted quietly, both knowing he wasn't ready to reach for anything outside his grief. At home, Emma found herself spending more time with Nathan. They sifted through boxes of old family photographs, the dust coating their fingertips, the air scented faintly of time. Nathan's stories, once background noise to Emma's childhood, began to take on new color. He told her about his youth, about his first love, about the son he'd lost, her brother, the baby she never knew. Listening to him, Emma began to see her father less as the distant, stoic figure she'd painted him to be, and more as a man shaped by his own losses, his own quiet endurance. The sharp edges between them began to soften, worn down by these small, patient hours. At home, though, silence continued to settle between Emma and Elon like an unwelcome guest. Their words became fewer, their movements carefully orchestrated to avoid stepping into each other's grief. They passed each other in hallways, in doorframes, tethered by memory, but growing ever more distant. Julia, too, began to open the door to her own isolation. "People don't talk to me the same anymore," she confessed during one of their walks. "Even the ones who don't say anything, they look at me like I'm broken, like I'm dangerous." Emma's throat tightened. "Do you have anyone else to talk to? Friends?" Julia shrugged. "Not really. I think I used to, but I stopped answering their messages. I stopped going to things. It all feels so far away now." A quiet ache settled between them. One day, sitting beneath the rustling canopy of the park, Emma found the courage to ask what she had long avoided. "Can you tell me what happened that day? I mean, really tell me." Julia's breath trembled, her fingers picking at the seam of her jeans. "I've gone over it so many times. I was late. I was rushing. I didn't see her in time. It happened so fast. I didn't even have a chance to hit the brakes properly. I thought maybe she'd stop running, but she didn't." Her voice cracked, tears welling, but not falling. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, Emma. I didn't mean." Emma reached out, her hand resting gently over Julia's trembling one. "I know." The words surprised her, how naturally they came, how much she meant them. In the days that followed, life surged forward in the form of Isaac's newborn son. The baby arrived just after sunrise, pink and squirming, his cries cutting through the sterile hush of the hospital room. Emma held him carefully, the weight of his tiny body a strange mixture of comfort and pain. Love bloomed in her chest, fierce and immediate, but it was laced with something else, something hollow and trembling. A reminder of what had been lost. Elon struggled to hold the child. His arms tensed as the baby nestled against him, his throat tightening as the memory of Katie's weight flooded back to him. He smiled, but it was brittle, his heart aching with the unbearable overlap of joy and grief. At the small family gathering that followed, Emma watched Isaac beam with new purpose, his hands steady as he swaddled his son. She watched Abigail's tired but glowing face, the quiet triumph in her eyes. And Emma realized that their grief had taken them down separate roads. She and Elon had once been bound by the same rhythm of love, the same circle of joy. But now, though they still shared the weight of loss, they no longer carried it in the same way. Their hearts beat to different tempos. Later that night, as they undressed in silence, Elon looked at her, not with anger, not with expectation, but with the worn-out gaze of someone who finally understood. "I don't think we'll ever be who we were," he whispered. Emma's voice was soft, almost a breath. "No, I don't think we can." But beneath those words, unspoken, lingered a fragile thread, a quiet question of who they might still become. Elon's restlessness had begun to take shape. One morning, without fanfare, he arranged for them to visit a house on the edge of town, a quiet place with pale shutters and a wide, untamed yard. He didn't present it as a solution. He didn't call it new beginning. He simply said, "Maybe we should look." Emma walked the halls of the empty house slowly, her footsteps echoing against bare walls. It smelled faintly of new paint and something older, something like dust and time. She ran her fingers along the smooth banister, peered into sunlit rooms, but the quiet followed her, clinging like mist. A house was just a house. It could not undo what had happened. When they left, Emma sat in the car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You know moving won't fix us, right?" Elon stared straight ahead, the keys heavy in his hand. "I know, but maybe it would help us breathe." Emma's answer was a silence neither of them could fully decipher. Later that week, Julia surprised her with a small, hand-bound notebook. "I wrote something," she said shyly, her pale fingers trembling slightly as she passed it to Emma. "It's just a story, inspired by you, by Katie." Emma turned the pages slowly, her throat tightening as she recognized echoes of her daughter in the illustrated character. A curious, brave girl who crossed into parallel worlds, always finding her way home. It was not a grand gift. It was not an apology. It was something much quieter, a gesture of care, of shared space. In the quiet of their home, Elon and Emma returned to the grief support group, though they still sat on the edges of the conversation, feeling like visitors in someone else's sorrow. They listened as others spoke of anniversaries, of holidays survived, of lives painstakingly rebuilt. Emma found herself no longer bristling when Nathan's voice threaded into her memory. She had spent so long rejecting his comparisons, believing his grief lived in a separate, unreachable place. But now, she realized that perhaps sorrow was not a competition. Perhaps there were no measurements in pain, only different shades of the same ache. Elon's own journey twisted in ways neither of them had expected. One afternoon, he found Julia outside her school, her backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. She paused when she saw him, her breath catching visibly. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice calm but tightly wound. Julia nodded cautiously. Standing there on the sidewalk, Elon searched her face, desperate to find some trace of intention, some explanation that would make sense of what he had lost. "You know you changed our whole lives. You know that, right?" Tears welled in Julia's gray-green eyes, but she didn't look away. "I know. I think about it every day. I don't get to leave it behind. I don't get to stop carrying it." For a long moment, Elon considered what he wanted to say. He had imagined this encounter 100 different ways, most of them sharp, angry, unforgiving. But as he stood there, he realized the weight of his rage had thinned, worn down by exhaustion, by time, by the fragile ways Emma had begun to live alongside her grief. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself," he said at last, his voice thick. "I've been doing enough of that for both of us." Julia's breath hitched, but she offered no words. They parted quietly, no resolution promised, but something had shifted. That evening, Emma thanked Julia for the story. "It brought me peace," she confessed, her voice soft but certain. "For the first time in a long time, I could almost imagine Katie out there somewhere, happy, whole." Julia's shoulders eased, her face opening in a way Emma hadn't seen before. Elon made his own quiet surrender that night. He scrolled through his phone until he found the video, the one he'd watched hundreds of times, the one where Katie twirled in the sunlit yard, her laugh rising like wind chimes. His thumb hovered over the screen for what felt like forever. And then, with a slow exhale, he deleted it. It wasn't a rejection of memory. It wasn't letting go. It was a release from a compulsion, the loop he could no longer live inside. The next morning, Emma planted flowers in the yard, digging her fingers into the soil, anchoring herself in the simple act of creating life from the ground. She chose soft purple blooms and delicate whites, something Katie would have liked. It became her quiet ritual, a space to tend, to remember, to sit in the presence of what could not be undone. Even Nathan, whom Elon had once viewed with cautious distance, began to feel like a quiet ally. His steady, unhurried presence no longer irritated Elon, who now recognized the value of someone who asked for nothing but simply stayed. Elon and Emma remained fragile, their silences frequent, but they found themselves brushing hands now and then, small, hesitant moments of closeness that neither rushed to explain. They weren't healed, they weren't whole, but they were still there. When Isaac and Abigail announced the baby's name, Nathan, Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was a simple, thoughtful gesture that wove their family's past and present together, tying loose threads into something that, while not perfect, at least felt continuous. Emma began to wonder if she could stop fighting grief like it was an enemy. Maybe it wasn't something to conquer. Maybe it was something to live with, to soften against. One evening, as they sat quietly on the back steps, watching the sun bleed into the horizon, Elon finally spoke. "We don't have to rush this. We don't have to keep trying to fit into someone else's timeline." Emma's voice was almost a whisper. "No more expectations. No more pretending we're supposed to be done by now." She nodded, her fingers brushing lightly against his. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't a grand return. It was just a quiet surrender to the pace of their own hearts. And for now, that was enough. The park was quiet in the morning, wrapped in the cool hush of early sunlight. Emma walked its familiar paths, her steps slow, each one pressing softly into the gravel. She had avoided this place for so long, believing its air was too heavy, its spaces too sharp. But something in her had softened, or maybe simply tired of resisting. She settled onto a worn bench that overlooked the intersection, the same place where Katie's laughter had once danced across the grass, where the rhythm of a life had been interrupted in an instant. Emma sat there, not to rewrite the past, not to battle it, but simply to be with it. Julia approached quietly, her presence no longer a surprise. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply sat beside Emma, both of them watching a morning unfold, allowing silence to do what words could not. After a long while, Emma spoke, her voice soft as the breeze. "Katie used to love running ahead of me here. She'd always turn to make sure I was still following. Every time. Except that day." Her words hung in the air, fragile but steady. "She probably thought she could reach the other side before I told her to stop," Emma continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench. "She was so sure of herself, brave in the way little ones are." Julia's throat tightened, but she said nothing, only listening. Emma found comfort in that, no apologies, no explanations. Just presence. Later that week, Elon gently approached her in the kitchen, his hands resting on the counter as though he feared she might pull away. "They're having another picnic. The support group. I thought maybe," he paused, "maybe we could go." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plan. It was simply an offering, a small opening in the careful walls they had built. Emma nodded. "I think I'd like that." Their progress became quiet, unhurried. They began preparing the house for a potential sale, not with urgency, but with the delicate rhythm of two people learning to let go piece by piece. They boxed up some of Katie's things, dusted shelves they hadn't touched in months, but neither of them forced the next step. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was becoming something they could release on their own terms. Emma confided in Isaac one afternoon as they sat in his living room, his baby asleep in his arms. "I'm not finished," she said, her voice careful, as though testing the weight of her own honesty. "Some days I feel like I'm getting there. Other days I don't." Isaac's answer was soft but firm. "You're not supposed to finish." He looked at her with the calm certainty of a brother who understood that grief wasn't a race to be won or a burden to be discarded. Elon, too, found a surprising ease in his growing friendship with Nathan. Their conversations no longer strained. They worked side by side repairing a loose porch step, shared quiet afternoons tending the yard. Elon came to appreciate the way Nathan offered presence without expectation, a steady rhythm that didn't require words to feel understood. Julia's story, her multiverse of infinite possibilities, became something Emma often returned to in her quiet moments. It didn't fix the ache. It didn't rewrite what had been. But it gave Emma a fragile thread to hold on to, the idea that somewhere perhaps Katie still laughed, still ran, still crossed safely to the other side. Elon and Emma began to rediscover the simplest things. They started walking together again, slowly reclaiming their shared routines, the Sunday morning coffee, the way they folded laundry side by side, the habit of lingering near each other in the kitchen. One afternoon, Elon surprised her with a small picnic in their backyard. Nothing grand, just a soft blanket, sandwiches, and slices of fruit. The gesture was simple, but it cracked something open inside Emma. They sat under the shade of the maple tree, sharing food and quiet conversation, creating a new memory that could live alongside the old ones. Isaac often brought the baby to visit. Emma held her nephew carefully, her arms now steady, the weight of him no longer a piercing reminder, but a quiet blend of warmth and gentle sadness. She loved him, and in holding him, she found she could love something new without betraying what had been. Together, she and Elon took small, brave steps back into social life. They attended a neighborhood gathering, cautiously stepping into the familiar circles they had once abandoned. There were awkward pauses, uncertain smiles, but there was also a slow, genuine welcome. The world had not forgotten them. It had simply been waiting. One morning, Emma found a small envelope in her mailbox. Inside was Julia's final comic, a closing chapter. In it, the little girl from a story continued her travels through parallel worlds, but eventually found a place she could stay, a place that felt like home. No note accompanied it, no explanation. It was a quiet goodbye, tender and complete. Emma tucked it safely among her most precious things. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the soft clink of teacups between them, Emma turned to Elon and said, "Some days will always be harder." Elon nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I know, and some days will be lighter." Neither of them needed to finish the sentence. They sat there as the sun faded, their shoulders gently resting against each other, not in a rush, not in a race towards something called healing. They understood now that the journey wasn't about forgetting or replacing, nor was it about arriving at a place where sorrow no longer touched them. It was about learning to carry the weight, together, quietly, at their own pace. And somehow that was enough. The house no longer felt like a museum. Slowly, without fanfare, Emma and Elon began to move through it differently. There were still quiet rooms, still corners filled with memories that pressed on their ribs when they lingered too long, but the house had begun to breathe again. Mornings settled into a gentle rhythm. They shared breakfast at the small wooden table near the window, the sunlight soft against the faded curtains. They didn't fill the space with forced words. Their conversations came in fragments, sometimes nothing more than the clink of spoons against bowls or the offer of another cup of coffee. It was enough. Words, like grief, didn't need to be chased. Elon took to walking in the mornings, at first dragging his feet, as though testing whether his body would agree to motion again. In time, he began running, his breath sharpening, his muscles remembering. It wasn't about reclaiming something lost, it was about remembering that his body still belonged to him. Emma returned to the garden she had abandoned. The soil had grown wild in her absence, the weeds tangled thick around the soft buds of her neglected flowers. She knelt in the dirt, pulling gently at the roots, her hands covered in earth. There was comfort in the rhythm, in the texture of soil beneath her fingers, in the small victories of coaxing life from what had become unruly. Julia's presence faded like a thread that had gently completed its weave. Emma no longer crossed paths with her at the park or received notes in her mailbox. The girl had moved forward as she should, carrying her own quiet journey with her. Elon made small visits to Katie's old school, sometimes leaving modest donations for the library or the playground fund. He didn't stay long. He didn't announce himself. It was a quiet gesture, a way to tether something good to Katie's name without needing to explain. At home, Emma became more present in Isaac's new life. She found herself reaching for the baby without hesitation, marveling at his smallness, his newness. She offered to hold him while Isaac unpacked groceries. She accompanied him on slow walks through the neighborhood, their conversation flowing more easily now. The ache of loss and the warmth of new life could coexist, and Emma discovered that holding both was not betrayal. It was simply the shape of life now. Nathan's steady presence continued, a soft current beneath their days. He arrived without fanfare, always with the same patience, the same gentle silence that asked for nothing in return. Emma began to see him differently, not as the man who had failed to protect her from sorrow, but as someone who had quietly learned to live with his own. One evening, as they sat sorting through another box of old photos, Emma looked at him with new clarity. "You've been carrying this a long time, haven't you?" Nathan's hand paused on a worn picture of his late son, his thumb brushing over the edges. "Some weights don't go away. You just get better at balancing them." His words stayed with her. Elon took to repairing things around the house. The leaky faucet in the kitchen, the creaky step on the porch, the door that had always stuck just enough to be an irritation. There was something satisfying in the work, in making the house usable again, not as a shrine but as a space where they could begin to live fully as it was now. Emma surprised herself the day she pulled out her old recipe book. Baking had once been Katie's favorite ritual, standing on tiptoes to peer over the counter, her small hands pressing flour into dough. Emma had tucked those recipes away, convinced she would never return to them. But there she was sifting flour, kneading gently, her movements cautious but steady. The smell of warm bread filled the kitchen, not as a ghost of the past, but as a quiet signal that some things could return, not in the same shape, not with the same voices, but still. They learned to welcome small joys again without guilt. A favorite song humming through the house, the comfort of a shared blanket on the couch. Laughing, carefully at first, as though waiting for some invisible punishment, but slowly, with fewer reservations. They returned to the grief support group, this time walking in side by side, feeling less like guests and more like part of the room. They listened to others whose losses stretched across years, whose stories had slowly unfolded into acceptance, even into peace. The conversations shifted. They no longer orbited pain alone. People spoke about love that endured, about remembering without collapsing. Emma and Elon, sitting close, felt the quiet realization that their place in this story had changed. They were no longer frozen on the day everything fell apart. Elon squeezed Emma's hand gently as they listened. She didn't pull away. At home, they no longer spoke about selling the house. The urgency to escape had dissolved. It was not a perfect home, but it was theirs. The walls had held their joy and their sorrow, and now they were learning to let those histories exist without one suffocating the other. One afternoon, as they folded laundry side by side, Emma paused, her gaze softening as she looked at Elon. "I think I used to believe we'd have to leave everything behind to survive." Elon folded a towel carefully, then smiled, not a broad smile, but a small, steady one. "I used to believe we couldn't survive unless we held on to everything." They were both wrong and both right. In their new patterns, they had discovered something neither of them expected. They didn't have to choose between remembering and living. They could do both. The town's farmers market was the kind of place Emma and Elon used to visit on slow Sunday mornings, back when their hands still automatically found each other's in crowded spaces. It had been years since they'd gone together, long enough for the idea to feel distant, even foreign. But on an ordinary morning, without planning, Emma suggested they stop by. The stalls were familiar but somehow new. Elon carried a small bag of fresh apples while Emma lingered over bunches of lavender, the soft scent brushing against her skin. Their conversations were light, tracing the edges of the ordinary. Emma pointed out a vendor selling homemade pies with a crooked sign, and Elon, without thinking, cracked a dry joke about the sign being as lopsided as his first attempt at building Katie's playhouse. The humor, quiet and unforced, settled between them like a shared language they had nearly forgotten. Emma smiled, the kind of smile that didn't vanish as quickly as it came. It was these small exchanges, soft, unguarded moments, that began to thread them together again. Isaac, sensing Emma's growing steadiness, invited her to babysit his son for an afternoon. "No pressure," he said gently. "Just thought, you might like some time with him. He's an easy baby. He already likes you." Emma hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. "I'd like that." When she held her nephew in her arms, something subtle shifted. His tiny fingers curled around hers, his breath slow and peaceful against her shoulder. She moved through the hours with careful ease, preparing bottles, singing softly, rocking him until his eyelids fluttered closed. The rhythm of caring for him became a quiet tether, a soft, steady heartbeat that gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't expected to reclaim. Elon, too, found comfort in these new family rhythms. He relaxed in Isaac and Abigail's home, comfortably accepting second servings of homemade cake, joining in gentle teasing, even offering to help assemble baby furniture, a task he once would have avoided. Nathan's stories began to unfold more frequently, not out of necessity, but out of trust. He spoke of his lost son, the brother Emma never knew, with tenderness instead of caution. Emma listened, really listened, no longer stiffening at the mention of sorrow, no longer pushing away his memories, as if her grief held greater weight. She began to understand that Nathan's quiet endurance had been shaped by the same hollow spaces she now navigated. Together, Emma and Elon planted a small tree in their yard, a living tribute to Katie, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. The roots pressed into the soil as their hands worked side by side. It was a quiet act, deliberate but unceremonious, as though they both knew the tree would do its work slowly, silently, year after year. The grief group introduced new faces, people whose losses were still raw, their stories thick with fresh ache. Emma and Elon no longer felt like outliers. They found themselves gently offering what they had once been unable to hear: patience, presence, simple companionship through the hard edges of mourning. Elon began mentoring new fathers in the group, not with grand advice, but with steady, practical words. He shared how he handled the empty rooms, how he managed to hold his wife's silence without pressing. His voice carried a quiet steadiness that other men leaned into. Emma, too, found herself quietly supporting new mothers. She offered small, unassuming gestures, listening more than speaking, holding space where others could lay their grief down without fear of being rushed. The connection was not performative. It was a thread woven gently without force. Julia's comic book remained a quiet companion. Emma kept it tucked in her drawer, sometimes rereading the panels as if tracing the edges of another world where the little girl kept walking, kept laughing, where doors to other possibilities remained forever open. It continued to soothe something delicate inside her. One afternoon, Elon asked if Emma would consider going back to the park with him, the one they had both carefully avoided, the place where everything had changed. She agreed. The air was cool, the leaves crisp beneath their feet as they walked the familiar paths. They didn't speak much. They sat side by side on the old bench overlooking the intersection, their silence no longer a wall, but a bridge. The memory was there, undeniable, but no longer consumed them. It sat with them, as grief does when it is no longer new. Elon broke the silence, his voice thoughtful, steady. "I've been thinking, maybe we could take a trip sometime. Nothing big. Just us. I don't know. A few days somewhere." Emma turned toward him, her gaze soft. For so long, the idea of stepping outside their carefully rebuilt world had felt impossible, even dangerous, as if happiness elsewhere would be a betrayal. But now, it didn't feel that way. The world no longer seemed like something they had to tiptoe around. "I think I'd like that," she said. The possibility of traveling felt like the opening of a door neither of them had dared to touch. They didn't need to plan it yet. It was enough to know that the horizon no longer felt out of reach. As they walked home, their steps matched without effort, their hands brushing occasionally but comfortably apart. They didn't need to hold on too tightly. Life no longer felt like a burden they were dragging behind them. It felt like a road they could walk, together, gently, wherever it might lead. It was Emma's idea, though it surprised them both. "Maybe we could go away for a weekend," she said one afternoon, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her teacup. "Nothing big, just somewhere quiet." Elon looked up from his notebook, his expression careful, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance they had found. "The countryside." Emma nodded. "I think I'd like to see something new, even if it's just trees." They chose a modest cabin tucked between soft hills and winding dirt roads where the world moved slower and silence was a kindness. The weekend unfolded gently, with long walks and quiet meals, no itinerary, no pressure to fill the space with words. In the quiet, they found something neither of them had known they were missing: a space where their grief could rest, where it didn't have to explain itself, where the air felt wide enough to breathe fully. Back home, the seasons shifted with subtle grace. Isaac's baby grew quickly, his chubby legs kicking with new strength, his laugh bubbling up easily. Emma became a cherished presence in his life, her arms a safe place, her voice a familiar rhythm. She moved through Isaac's home with gentle ease, folding tiny clothes, soothing tears, watching with quiet wonder as life, persistent and unhurried, continued to unfold. Elon, too, found his own quiet rhythms in the neighborhood. He fixed the loose latch on a neighbor's gate, mended a crooked mailbox post, patched the cracked sidewalk in front of an elderly couple's home. He didn't ask for thanks. These small repairs became his way of stepping back into the world, offering quiet acts of kindness without needing to be seen. Emma's afternoons with Nathan grew more personal, more richly layered. They sewed together, Emma mending an old apron, Nathan piecing together fabric squares from his late wife's collection. Between the careful stitches, they traded recipes, stories, memories. Nathan's hands, steady and patient, moved with quiet expertise, and Emma realized she had never really seen him like this before. A man still building, still tending, still capable of creating something gentle from what remained. Change arrived in soft, inevitable waves. Julia moved away for college, the quiet announcement tucked inside a brief message. Emma knew the distance would settle between them, and it felt right. Their paths had crossed when they needed to, when both were reaching for something they could not name. Now Julia's absence carried a bittersweet closure, the kind that left Emma with gratitude rather than longing. One morning, Emma gathered a small box of Katie's books, their worn pages filled with notes and fingerprints, and donated them to the local library. She didn't tell anyone. It was a quiet gesture, a soft remembrance that allowed those stories to continue living in other hands. Elon began sketching ideas for new projects around the house, not as a distraction, but as a sign that his imagination was cautiously wandering into the future again. He talked about building a small bench for the garden, maybe replanting the hedges in the spring. It was Isaac who mentioned the upcoming anniversary at the grief support group. They're inviting people who've been coming for a while to speak if they want to. No pressure. Elon and Emma exchanged hesitant glances. Maybe we could go, Elon said slowly. Not because we have answers, but maybe just to say we're still here. They agreed cautiously, unsure of what they could offer, unsure of whether they were ready. When the evening arrived, the community hall was filled with familiar faces and new ones, people still learning how to carry their grief, people who hadn't yet found their footing. Elon spoke first, his voice steady but quiet. I used to think I had to get through grief quickly, that it was a finish line I was supposed to reach. But it's not like that. Some days it feels far away. Some days it feels like it just happened. I guess it comes in waves. And you just have to stand there and let it wash over you sometimes. He paused, his hands resting on the edges of the podium. There's no perfect way to do this. There's just your way. Emma followed, her voice softer but clear. I tried to shape my grief into something that made sense. I tried to push it away when I thought it was too much, and I tried to cling to it when I was afraid of forgetting. But grief, it's not something we control. It changes shape. It shows up in strange places, and it's okay to let it move the way it needs to. As she looked out over the faces in the room, Emma saw the quiet flickers of recognition, the silent relief of those who had feared they were doing it wrong. After the gathering, Emma and Elon walked home hand in hand, their steps unhurried, the night air cool against their skin. Do you realize, Emma said softly, how far we've come? Elon's thumb brushed gently over her hand. Yeah, I do. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt full, like a space they had built together, where words didn't need to carry all the weight. They didn't speak about what came next. They didn't make promises to never fall backward. They simply walked forward steady, side by side, through the seasons that would continue to change. Emma found her rhythm again, not all at once, but in the slow weaving of small, quiet days. Her nephew had become a constant presence, his world steadily expanding, his tiny hands reaching out for hers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They developed little rituals, picking wildflowers in the morning, reading the same picture book each afternoon, baking soft rolls with sticky fingers and lopsided shapes. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered. They formed a tender thread that stitched Emma back into the living fabric of her family. Elon, too, found his way outward. He began volunteering at the community center on Saturdays, drawn to the steady rhythm of fixing things, broken chairs, loose hinges, toys missing wheels. He spoke little at first, but in the quiet work, people began to seek him out, asking advice, offering simple thanks. His hands remembered how to steady, to build, to mend. And slowly, he realized that he was not only fixing objects, he was quietly helping people hold themselves together. At home, Emma reopened her old recipe books, tracing her fingers over handwritten notes left by her mother, remembering the warmth that once filled her kitchen. Gradually, she brought those meals back to life, the smells curling through the house like an old song rediscovered. Family dinners became more frequent, and with them, laughter returned, not the strained, fragile kind, but something rounder, more settled. Isaac and Abigail became a steady part of their lives, their bond reshaping itself with comforting weight. They gathered for simple meals, watched the baby take his first wobbly steps across Emma's living room, traded stories that tumbled out like softened stones. The once fractured pieces of their family were no longer sharp. They fit, quietly, without needing to be perfect. Nathan's stories, which Emma had once listened to with quiet distance, began to sink indifferently now. His tales of endurance, of stumbling through his own decades of loss and love, took on new color. They weren't lessons. They weren't answers. They were just a reminder that life, for all its weight, could still stretch forward. One afternoon, Elon began restoring the porch swing where Katie used to play. The wood had grayed, the chains stiff with rust. He scrubbed, sanded, repainted, his movements deliberate, reverent. He didn't speak as he worked, but Emma could see in the way he traced his hands over the smooth boards that this was not an attempt to preserve the past. It was an offering, a quiet invitation for new stories to be made. When he finished, they sat there together in the soft evening light, the swing creaking gently beneath their weight. The air was thick with memory, but the space between them felt light, easy. Together, they made another choice that once would have been unthinkable. They decided to repaint Katie's room. It was not to erase her. It was to allow the room to breathe again, to offer it life beyond its silent preservation. They moved carefully, preserving the most precious keepsakes, a worn stuffed animal, her favorite storybooks, a box of drawings she had once proudly taped to the walls. These they tucked away safely, not hidden, but honored. The new color was soft and warm, a pale sky blue that seemed to open the space rather than close it. The house, which had once pressed in around them, now unfolded. It no longer felt like a place trapped in the day of Katie's absence. It had become a home where life continued, where family gathered, where laughter no longer arrived as an intruder. One morning, Emma found a postcard in the mailbox. It was from Julia, just a short note from her college town, a photograph of autumn trees, and a simple line written in careful script. "Thank you for listening. I hope you're well." Emma smiled softly, tucking the postcard into her keepsake box alongside Katie's treasures. It was not a reopening of their bond, but a quiet closing, a thread gently tied. Julia's stories of the multiverse still lingered in Emma's mind, but they no longer haunted her. They became a comfort, a soft place to rest her imagination when she thought of Katie. Not as an escape, but as a gentle curiosity, a maybe, a somewhere, a possibility that needed no proof. In their kitchen, Elon began joining Emma as she baked for family gatherings, his hands clumsy but willing. Flour dusted their sleeves, their laughter rising with the scent of warm bread. The ritual was familiar, but the weight of it had changed. It was no longer bound to the ache of what had been lost. It belonged to them now, reshaped and alive. Emma and Nathan settled into a gentle cadence of conversation. They talked about the past with a softness that neither of them had known they could reach. They no longer avoided the memories that once sat like stones in their throats. They let them unfold carefully, sometimes with tears, sometimes with quiet smiles. There was affection there now, not just the heavy shape of shared sorrow. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, Emma and Elon pulled out their wedding album. They had not touched it in years. They turned the pages slowly, pausing over photographs they had once memorized. The faces staring back at them felt familiar, but they no longer mourned who they had been. They had not lost those people. They had grown from them. They sat side by side on the porch as the day folded into dusk, the swing gently swaying beneath them. Emma's head rested lightly on Elon's shoulder, their hands intertwined, their silence full and steady. The sky stretched wide before them, and for the first time in a long time, it did not feel like something they needed to chase or escape. It simply was a quiet expanse, tender and open. Here, in this place they had feared they would never reach, they were not fully healed, but they were whole in a new way. Together, present, home. The air in the countryside felt wider, softer, as if it had been waiting for them to finally arrive. Emma and Elon's weekend trip was simple, tucked into a quiet stretch of hills where time moved slower and the noise of their grief seemed to thin against the open sky. They walked along gentle paths lined with tall grass, their steps unhurried, their breaths steady and full. For the first time in years, Emma realized she was breathing without the sharp edge of waiting for the next memory to sting, for the next silence to settle heavily between them. Out here, it was easier to just be. Elon's hand brushed against hers as they wandered, sometimes holding, sometimes not. The space between them no longer needed to be carefully managed. There was room for laughter now, quiet and genuine. They laughed when a stray breeze tossed Emma's hat into a puddle, when Elon misread a trail marker and led them in a wide, unintended loop. It was the kind of laughter that lingered, light and easy, not weighed down by guilt. In the village nearby, they stumbled upon a small bookstore, its windows fogged slightly from the morning chill. Emma's fingers drifted along the spines, pausing on a familiar title, one of Katie's favorite storybooks. The worn cover and faded pages felt like a memory gently reaching back to her. She turned the book over in her hands, a quiet ache blooming in her chest. Elon watched her from across the aisle, understanding without needing to ask. Later, without a word, he purchased it and tucked it into his bag, not to bring the past back, but to carry it forward with them. They found a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree and spread out a small picnic. The breeze rustled the leaves above them as they sat close, sharing simple food and softer conversation. They spoke about Katie, not about the day they lost her, but about the days that built her life. The silly faces she used to make, the way she would insist on wearing mismatched socks, the softness in her voice when she would ask for one more story before bed. Emma didn't feel herself unraveling as she spoke. She felt herself filling, quietly, with the bittersweet warmth of remembering. It was the first time they had spoken of Katie like this, without collapsing under the weight of her absence. That evening, back in their small rented cottage, Emma opened a new journal she had brought but hadn't yet touched. She wrote a simple note to Katie, not to mark an occasion, not to perform a ritual, but because it felt right. We walked today. We laughed today. I think you would have liked it here. She kept the journal for herself, a private space where Katie's memory could live quietly without needing to be spoken aloud. Elon spent the weekend taking photographs, open fields, quiet roads, the delicate curve of Emma's hand resting against a tree. He wasn't trying to capture grief. He was quietly building something new, gathering pieces of their life that would remind them that they had kept going. Under the soft light of the countryside, they began to talk about more trips. Nothing grand, just small adventures, places to see together, memories to gently weave into their future. When they returned home, the house no longer felt like something to tiptoe around. It felt like a space ready for new breath, for quiet renewal. They cleaned, they rearranged, they opened windows to let the cool air sweep through. There was no urgency. They simply moved through the rooms, offering them fresh life. Emma planted new flowers in the yard, carefully tending the soil where Katie's tree now stood taller. She chose soft pinks and whites, the kinds Katie used to pick on their walks. Each bloom became a small act of remembrance, not frozen in time, but living, growing. Elon, in his steady way, began to teach Isaac's baby how to use the porch swing. He would steady the boy's small body, offering gentle pushes, watching him laugh with the kind of joy that needed no translation. It was a quiet passing of happiness, a soft way to keep the swing moving. Nathan, ever steady, continued to offer his quiet presence. One afternoon, as he watched Emma tending the flowers, he said simply, "It's good to love what's still here." His words didn't linger like heavy lessons. They settled gently, like soft soil around new roots. Elon found his way back to old friendships. Slowly, without force, he began accepting invitations, coffee with an old co-worker, a backyard gathering with familiar faces. It was not a rejection of grief, but a widening of life. The people who welcomed him back didn't press. They simply opened space. The house, which had once felt like a monument to what was gone, now held warm rhythms. Family dinners, new conversations, the scent of baking bread rising again. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Emma and Elon sat together on their porch swing. Their hands found each other without thought, their bodies leaning comfortably close. The silence stretched wide between them, not as a void, but as something full, a space they had rebuilt with gentle patience. Emma rested her head against Elon's shoulder, her gaze soft on the fading sky. "It feels different now," she murmured. Elon's thumb traced slow circles across her hand. "Yeah, it does." The swing creaked beneath them, steady and slow. They didn't need to name it. They didn't need to define how far they had come or how much they still carried. They simply sat together in the quiet renewal of their life, deeply present, softly whole. Emma's hands pressed gently into the soil of the community garden, the cool earth crumbling between her fingers. She hadn't planned to stay long that first morning, but something about the quiet hum of the garden, the soft shuffle of feet, the distant chatter, the simple act of planting, invited her to linger. The garden was small but alive with promise. Rows of budding vegetables, patches of wildflowers, small trees beginning to stretch toward the sky. It was the first place outside of her own home where Emma felt a kind of forward motion, a quiet, daily invitation to nurture life instead of tiptoe around its fragility. Elon had quietly expanded his work at the community center. He no longer fixed things only with his hands. He had begun organizing small gatherings, encouraging others to build what had broken, to step toward each other with steady patience. His satisfaction came not from grand accomplishments, but from quiet moments, a repaired toy handed back to a child, a neighbor's shy thank you, the steady rhythm of ordinary kindness. Isaac and Abigail became central threads in their weekends, drawing Emma and Elon into a rhythm of shared meals, backyard games, and long walks that no longer felt like careful steps around sorrow. They sat together on picnic blankets while the baby toddled between them, his delighted squeals becoming the soft soundtrack of their new chapters. Nathan remained a steady figure in Emma's days. They no longer danced around the edges of their grief. Instead, they moved through it together, sharing stories of what had been and what still remained. Their conversations, once cautious, now settled comfortably into the open air. There was no longer a need to compare losses or protect wounds. There was only quiet understanding. Emma found herself smiling more easily, her laughter surfacing without effort. The weight in her chest had not disappeared. It had softened, reshaped itself into something she could carry. One afternoon, Elon suggested repainting parts of the house. Not to start over, he clarified, just to make it ours again. They chose soft colors, nothing loud, nothing demanding. They painted the porch rails a gentle cream, touched up the worn shutters, brightened the kitchen walls. With each stroke, The house shed a little of its former stillness and welcomed their present life. When Isaac's baby's first birthday approached, Emma offered to bake the cake. Her hands moved carefully through the familiar steps, measuring flour, cracking eggs, folding butter into soft peaks. It had once been a ritual tied so tightly to Katie that Emma had set it aside, fearing the ache it would bring. But this time, the process felt light, tender, infused with quiet hope. The family gathered in Isaac's backyard. The sunlight dappled through swaying branches. There was no grand fanfare, no need for perfect photos. Just simple joys, a baby's chubby hands reaching eagerly for frosting, soft laughter, the warmth of hands resting comfortably on each other's shoulders. Emma watched Elon lift the baby onto the porch swing, guiding his small fingers along the ropes, passing down the joy that had once belonged to Katie. Their grief group meetings became less frequent. Emma and Elon no longer felt the same pull to sit in that circle of shared sorrow. They carried the stories of those they'd met, but they had found their own rhythm now, one that allowed space for grief but did not build life around it. One evening, Elon gently suggested, maybe we could visit some of the places Katie loved. Not to chase something, just to be there, with her memory. Emma nodded, the idea settling softly in her chest. It no longer felt like something too sharp to approach. It felt like a gentle way to walk alongside what remained. That same week, a brief note arrived in the mail. Julia's handwriting was unmistakable. Thank you for seeing me, for not turning away. I think you saved me more than you know. I wish you all the peace this world can offer. The words were simple, but Emma read them slowly, her fingers lingering on the paper, as though she could trace the quiet gratitude that had passed between them. She carefully placed Julia's final note inside the keepsake box, next to the comic book that had once bridged the impossible space between them. Elon, in his quiet way, began organizing a neighborhood event, a simple afternoon gathering with shared food and easy conversation. He reached out to old friends, encouraged neighbors who had once remained distant. The event was not grand, but it was full of warmth. Children's laughter, the clink of glasses, the low hum of easy company. Elon found comfort in these moments of connection, in building small, steady ties that held people together. Emma's days at the garden became a cherished rhythm. She would arrive early, tending the fragile green shoots, pulling weeds, pausing to watch bees drift lazily among the blossoms. It was here that she learned the quiet patience of tending life, of knowing some things would take time, that not everything would bloom at once, and that some seeds would surprise her by thriving when she least expected. Together, Emma and Elon wove new patterns, carefully stitching their shared tomorrows into the fabric of their days. They didn't push away the grief, nor did they surrender to it. Instead, they let it live quietly among their joys, a tender thread that would always remain, but would no longer define them. One evening, as they sat again on their porch swing, the air soft with the scent of evening flowers, Emma rested her head against Elon's shoulder. Their silence was full, warm, companionable. "This feels like life," Emma whispered. Elon's hand gently squeezed hers. "It does." They had not left the past behind. They had simply learned to carry it with them, woven gently with hope, into the days still unfolding before them. The beach stretched before them, quiet and familiar, its shoreline softened by the years that had passed since their last visit. Emma and Elon walked side by side, their shoes in their hands, their feet pressing gently into the damp sand. This was where they had once come with Katie, a place of laughter, of small discoveries, of chasing waves that slipped away just as quickly as they'd arrived. There had been a time when returning here would have shattered Emma, but now the ache that settled in her chest was softer, rounder. It no longer pushed her to the edge of tears. It simply lived alongside her, like the steady pull of the tide. They spoke openly as they walked, their memories rising easily between them. They remembered Katie's fascination with seashells, the way she would meticulously line them up along her towel, as if curating her own little museum. They laughed when they recalled her fierce determination to build a sandcastle taller than Elon's, a project that always ended with a delighted collapse. The weight of these memories no longer frightened them. They had stopped avoiding them. Instead, they let them sit between them, treasured and intact. Elon paused often to take photographs, the glimmer of sunlight on the water, the delicate footprints they left behind, the curve of Emma's hand brushing over smooth stones. He was quietly building a new family album, not to replace what had been, but to continue the story. Emma found her own way of preserving what mattered. She began writing short reflections on motherhood, on the ache and endurance of grief, on the quiet ways life teaches you to keep moving forward. She didn't set out to share them. At first, they were only for herself, a way to untangle the knots inside her, to give shape to the things that had lived wordlessly in her for so long. When she showed a few pages to Nathan, he read them carefully, his thumb resting in the crease of the notebook as he turned the pages slowly. When he looked up, his eyes were steady. "You should keep writing," he said softly. "Your story matters." Isaac and Abigail, now fully woven into the center of Emma and Elon's life, invited them on a small family trip, a quiet weekend by the lake. It would have been easy in the past to hesitate, to imagine all the ways the memories might pinch or how the weight of what was missing might press into the joy. But Emma and Elon accepted, not with caution, but with the steady willingness that had become their quiet strength. Emma continued tending her garden, rising early to feel the cool earth beneath her fingertips, to check the soft blooms, to gently guide the new growth. She no longer needed the garden to be a metaphor for healing. It had simply become a part of her life, something she loved, something that returned her to herself. Elon deepened his work at the community center, guiding others through their own grief, not with grand speeches or rigid steps, but with patience. He had become a quiet mentor, steady in his encouragement, his presence reminding others that time would not erase their sorrow, but would reshape it. They attended a wedding in their neighborhood one crisp autumn afternoon. Emma felt something tender stir in her chest as she watched the couple exchange their vows beneath soft strands of ivy and simple white ribbons. There was no need to protect herself from the sight of love blooming again. She understood now that love did not exist in competition, that it could stretch wide enough to hold both memory and new beginnings. When the music began, Elon extended his hand toward her. For a moment, Emma hesitated, not out of fear, but because the memory of dancing had been so tightly bound to what they had lost. But this time, she placed her hand in his, and they moved together in slow, careful steps, the kind that remembered and forgave all at once. Their bodies rediscovered the intimacy that grief had once stolen from them. Emma's writing slowly found its way beyond her notebook. She shared pieces with Isaac, with Abigail, with friends who quietly passed her words to others. The reflections became cherished stories among the people who had witnessed her journey, the stories of a woman who had learned to speak softly about what once felt unspeakable. Elon's photographs captured new seasons, the curve of the garden's blooms, the soft chaos of family gatherings, the sunlit edges of shared breakfasts. His images were not polished or staged. They were full of quiet life, of ordinary beauty preserved with care. They were invited to speak once more at the Grief Support Group's final gathering, a closing circle for those who had walked the long road together. Elon's words were simple. Grief doesn't leave us. It just makes space for other things to grow alongside it. Emma added, "We don't move on. We move with, and we learn that it's possible to build something beautiful with what remains." Their voices, their presence, offered something the others could hold, a hope that wasn't rushed or shallow, but rooted in patience. That evening, as the porch swing creaked beneath them, Emma and Elon sat in their familiar quiet. The air was cool, the sky blushing with the last light of day. Elon's hand found hers, steady warm. "This is home," Emma whispered. Elon nodded. It always was. The life they had rebuilt was not shiny or perfect. It was textured, layered with sorrow and love, with absence and presence. But it was theirs. And sitting together, watching the sunset melt into the horizon, they knew they had come full circle, not to where they had begun, but to where they could remain, fully alive, fully here, sharing the tomorrows they had once believed were lost. The woods near their home became a quiet sanctuary, a place where Emma and Elon found steady comfort. Their walks along the trails were never hurried. They strolled slowly, side by side, pausing often to listen to the leaves rustle or to watch the sunlight filter through the branches like threads of gold. The rhythm of these walks became part of their life, a soft, shared routine where silence was not empty, but full of quiet presence. At home, Isaac's son grew quickly, his joyful energy spilling into the corners of Emma and Elon's house like sunlight pouring through open windows. His footsteps pattered across their wooden floors, his giggles weaving through the air with bright, unguarded life. He climbed onto the porch swing with stubborn determination, coaxing Elon to push him higher, laughing in the face of the wind. Emma watched him often, the ache of missing Katie still there, but softened by the playful noise that filled their space. It wasn't a replacement. It was simply more life, layered gently over the grief that had settled but never disappeared. Her garden flourished, its blooms richer and fuller than ever. The soil she once tended as an act of fragile survival now thrived beneath her steady care. The flowers rose toward the sky, their colors soft but vibrant, a quiet symbol of life's persistence. She spoke to them sometimes as she worked, not in desperation, but with the kind of calm affection that had come to define her days. Elon's camera was rarely far from his side. He captured the way the seasons shifted around them, the way the flowers bowed under morning dew, the way Isaac's sun stretched toward the swing's highest point, the way Emma's hands brushed across the petals as if grounding herself in their texture. His photographs were quiet love letters to the life they had gently reclaimed. Nathan, now a daily presence, shared stories from his younger years, tales of long-forgotten friendships, foolish risks, and quiet triumphs. Emma listened closely, realizing she had come to know her father not just as a man shaped by loss, but as a full, intricate person with decades of memory stitched into his careful hands. These stories became threads in the fabric of their family, weaving Katie's absence into a broader, richer tapestry. Emma's writing deepened. What began as private reflections in a journal grew into stories she began to share, first with Isaac, then with friends, and eventually with the community. Her words no longer trembled under the weight of sorrow. They settled with calm strength, offering honesty without needing to explain or soften the ache. Encouraged by those around her, Emma gathered her journal pages into a small, self-published collection, simple, unadorned, but tenderly made. It was not about reaching many people. It was about speaking to those who, like her, had carried silent grief and were looking for permission to breathe again. The response surprised her. Strangers approached her with quiet thanks. Friends left notes tucked into her mailbox. Her words, it seemed, had given others a way to step forward, to name their own losses, to carry them with gentle patience. Elon, too, continued his quiet work of rebuilding connection. He organized a small charity event in Katie's memory, not a somber affair, but a lively gathering where neighbors shared food, children painted, and laughter rose easily into the air. It was a celebration of kindness, a space where grief was welcome, but not required to take center stage. In the afternoons, Elon began teaching local children to photograph nature. He handed them simple cameras and guided them along the familiar trails, teaching them to notice the curve of a petal, the play of light against bark, the story resting in quiet spaces. Through this, he built bridges, not only between himself and the children, but between their lives and the landscape they shared. Emma's bond with Isaac's son deepened, growing into something steady and enduring. She taught him to bake cookies with clumsy hands and to press wildflowers into books, just as she had once done with Katie. The boy began calling the porch swing his spot, and Emma smiled each time, knowing that the swing story had quietly passed to a new chapter. Their home, once so carefully navigated as though grief would crack beneath their feet, now pulsed with life. Family dinners became common, with laughter rising easily between bites. The walls that once echoed with silence now held the rhythm of shared stories, games, and soft music drifting from the kitchen. The porch swing remained their sacred place. It had become a seat for generations, a resting spot for storytelling, for gentle pushes, for quiet conversations held as the sky blushed into twilight. Emma and Elon often found themselves there, watching the boy, watching the flowers, watching each other. Their grief had not vanished. It had simply transformed. It was no longer an open wound, but a part of their love, a thread woven so carefully into their life that it gave their joy its depth. One evening, as they sat side by side on the swing, Elon said softly, "I think this is what it's supposed to be. Not fixed, just full." Emma's hand tightened around his. "I think so too." They didn't need to define the next chapter. They didn't need to rush toward it. It would come, as seasons always did, bringing with it new layers of memory, new colors, new losses, and new joys. They would carry all of it, the weight, the beauty, the ache, the love. And as they leaned into each other, their shoulders brushing, the porch creaking gently beneath them, they understood that this was the life they had rebuilt. Not by escaping the past, but by choosing again and again to live fully inside the present. The morning air was cool, still touched by the quiet mist that clung to the garden. Emma moved slowly among the soft blooms, her fingertips brushing over petals that had only just begun to unfurl. It had become her favorite time of day, those quiet, early hours when the world was still and her thoughts could move freely. Each plant in her garden told a story. Some she had planted in moments of fragile hope. Others she had placed in the soil to mark the seasons that had passed since Katie's laughter had last filled their home. And now, as she gently pulled weeds and smoothed the dark earth, Emma realized how far she and Elon had come, not by leaving their sorrow behind, but by learning to walk alongside it. Elon stepped onto the porch, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. The soft steam curled into the morning air. He crossed the yard without a word and handed her a mug, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. It had become a small ritual, these shared mornings, simple, quiet, but rich with meaning. Their house, once echoing with sharp silences and tiptoed grief, now thrummed with the gentle rhythms of life. Distantly, the soft clatter of breakfast plates reached them through the open window. The faint hum of Isaac's son's playful chatter drifted through the walls like sunlight, filling corners that had once felt too still. Isaac and Abigail visited often, their little boy now a lively, constant presence. He dashed through the halls with wild delight, his giggles weaving through the fabric of Emma and Elon's days, reminding them that the house had made room for new stories. Emma found her way to leading gentle writing workshops at the community center. She sat with those navigating their own losses, guiding them patiently as they tried to shape their stories. Her voice was steady, her words warm, and her quiet belief in the healing power of storytelling began to settle gently into the hearts of those who came to her. Elon continued his work in the community, offering his time, his presence, and his patience. He mentored those whose grief still sat sharp and unruly in their chests. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried the quiet authority of someone who understood the long road of sorrow and the slow unfolding of peace. Nathan's health, though not suddenly frail, had begun its subtle decline. Emma noticed it in his slower steps, in the quiet weariness that now lingered in his voice. She treasured their time together, savoring the afternoons spent sitting side by side, his hand resting in hers as they revisited stories from long ago. Their conversations no longer tiptoed around pain. They embraced it as part of their shared fabric. Emma's garden flourished. Its colors deepened with each season, its blooms opening wider, its roots steady. The garden became more than a symbol. It became a living testament to her quiet healing, a space where life continued, tender and unhurried. Together, Emma and Elon revisited old photo albums, now able to linger on Katie's pictures with soft smiles instead of the sharp pull of sorrow. The images no longer broke them open. They offered warmth, a gentle reminder of all the joy that had come before. Julia's comic book remained carefully preserved on their bookshelf. It was not revisited often, but its place there mattered, a quiet, tender reminder of the path they had once walked and of the compassion that had slowly stitched their broken spaces back together. The porch swing had become a gathering place, its soft creaks familiar and beloved. It was where Isaac's son now perched to hear stories, some new, some old, and some about Katie. Those stories were no longer whispered or avoided. They were told with warmth, their edges softened by time, their place in the family lovingly secured. Each year on Katie's birthday, Emma and Elon chose a simple act to honor her. They planted something new, a sapling, a row of wildflowers, a soft pink rose bush, gifts to the earth in her memory. There were no crowds, no ceremonies, just the two of them, kneeling in the soil, their hands steady, their hearts open. One afternoon, Emma and Nathan sat together on the porch, their hands intertwined. They spoke of old family stories, of Katie, of Emma's childhood, of love that had stretched across decades. There were pauses in their conversation, comfortable, steady pauses where silence spoke as clearly as words. The house had come alive again. It filled easily with the sound of Isaac's family, of shared meals, of warm laughter that rose without hesitation. The language of grief had softened. Laughter had become their natural language again. And still, Emma and Elon returned often to the porch swing. There they sat together as the sun lowered itself beyond the trees, their hands gently linked, their silence no longer aching but full. They understood now that the ache of loss would always remain, but it no longer ruled them. It had settled into something deeper, a love that endured, that stretched across time, that lived in the flowers they planted, in the stories they told, in the life they continued to build. Elon squeezed Emma's hand lightly, the weight of the years resting softly between them. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart at peace. "We're home," she whispered. And they were. Their story was never about leaving grief behind. It was about finding a way to carry it with love. Tulip, did this story bring back a memory for you? I would love to hear it. Leave your story in the comments. I read each one with care and gratitude. Sometimes, your words become part of someone else's healing.